Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, despite spotting and warning India's submarine found lurking right outside Pakistan's territorial waters 2 days back, Pakistan continues to push the olive branch towards India. Senior Pakistani diplomats, political leaders, they all continue to talk of de-escalation, offering to engage with India for any dialogue, just so that they can end conflict as it always wants peace in the region. But can we say the same about the sentiment being felt from across the border coming back? Not quite sure about that. And for that, we will be talking to our guests. I want to first introduce Mr. Sardar Asif Ahmed Ali, the former foreign minister, joining us on Newswire. Welcome to the show, sir. Quickly, to just get to the bottom of what is being felt across the border, Pakistan continues to push the olive branch. Do you feel like we are getting the right response from India?
We are getting some sort of a response because our delegation is going to Delhi and to talk about the Kartarpur crossing and some other issues on which we had agreed earlier. So we can't say that things are not moving. They are moving, but there's a lot of reluctance from New Delhi. Because everybody knows in the government that Mr. Modi's government has been very hostile towards Pakistan. And of late, the events that we've all witnessed have been pretty frightening for the whole world and for this region. And so that reluctance is there, and the provocations have not gone away. For instance, the submarine issue could have become a major crisis if we had reacted. We did not react. They were in our economic zone, and we did not take any action against the submarines. But we warned them, and we allowed them to move out of our waters. So again and again, Pakistan is trying to diffuse, while India is trying to provoke.
Right,
so
and can we also can we continue to expect this pattern, as you say, to continue until the elections take place, or the new government, or if comes into place in India?
No, I think the Modi's isolation is very strong inside India, and internationally too his isolation is visible. It's not that strong, but it is there. India is on the defensive. People have started questioning the Indian policies, at very high level. The capacity and the abilities of the armed forces are being questioned. And everything is now seems to be opening up against the Indian, armed forces, the quality of their leadership they're getting. And within India, there's a massive opposition to Modi. And everybody is critical of him. So in short, it's Modi who is now in deep isolation. And we are beyond that. Our Prime Minister made a very good gesture by releasing the Indian pilot.
Right.
And that has done wonders for us. And the world now has seen that we are not warmongers. We are not, we did not provoke them. And we are for very restrained and very constrained.
So, Mr. Sardar,
response.
Sorry to interrupt you there, but when you talk about Modi is facing isolation, not just internally, but internationally, if I were to plug in here that on Monday, President Donald Trump announced plans to end India's preferential trade treatment that essentially allows billions of dollars worth of daily exports to enter the US duty-free. Could this be taken as an indication that this is part of the isolation that it faces?
I'm not aware of this, but I think you're right. It's not just one event. I mean, it's all around India. All kinds of things have happened. I mean, they thought they had achieved a breakthrough in the OIC, which was Pakistan's constituency. We are one of the founder countries of OIC. And they had made a breakthrough there. And ultimately they found that instead of giving them something, OIC was very critical of India and very critical of their repression in Kashmir. And the language used was against India was very strong. So similarly, in all parts of the world, there are, I'm not prepared to say that India is a totally isolated country because it's a huge economy and the world wants economic relations. And that's one of the reasons the OIC wanted them in, in the summit. But certainly people are questioning them. Certainly people have condemned this whole incident and this fiasco of their surgical strike. And they are being exposed.
Right.
So I think it's more of exposure and less of isolation.
Okay.
But it is moving in the direction of isolation.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Sardar. And we'd like to welcome General Amjad Shoaib. You're a defense analyst. We're speaking to you from while you're in Islamabad. Let me ask you what I asked Mr. Sardar right off the bat. Do you feel like the tensions between Pakistan and India have diffused?
Obviously, we can say so because of the conditions prevailing at the moment, that the tensions have diffused and normalcy is going to prevail because both sides have decided to call back their ambassadors, their high commissioners to each other's country. So naturally, they are now reverting back to normalcy. But at the same time, there is a bit of uncertainty because I think India feels humiliated, and particularly Modi, he has put his political career at stake. And there is some time up to the elections now, and if they try to indulge in any mistake or any mischief to retrieve their position, then something can happen. So I think we don't have to lower our guards. We have to be careful and we have to be watchful. But most probably, I would say, they will desist and perhaps things will remain normal now. Till these ambassadors also they come back, and then thereafter things start moving in a proper way and proper direction and like a normal affair.
So just a little on.
Yes, please.
So just a little on the international reaction. President Donald Trump has announced that he is planning to take away the special status that India has. It allows duty-free exports from Delhi to the US. There's also multiple sporting events like the United World Wrestling and also the International Cricket Board that have basically come out and given some sort of warning to India that they need to stop mixing politics with sports.
I think they have taken these steps in the interest of the sports, and India has been politicizing the sports field also. These were two things, the cricket particularly and certain other sports where India and Pakistan, they could have helped each other in a way that the people-to-people contacts would have been increased. And perhaps it would have served the purpose of peace also in the region. But unfortunately, India all along has been politicizing this game or all the sports. And in the interest of sports, I think they have taken this step. But on the other hand, Trump, I think he is a businessman and he knows how to take care of their own interests. He says America first. So naturally, he has locked his arms with China also and at the same time India. One thing which we must know that India is trying to play on both the sides. They are keeping their relationship very warm with the Americans also, and at the same time they are keeping their contacts with China and Russia, and everywhere they are cooperating for business, for investment, and also for purchasing of weapons.
Right. General, let Let me, interrupt you here and also direct you towards what the international community, what is going on, is it recognizes what is happening in Kashmir and also acknowledging Pakistan's attempts. We saw a very prominent tweet that came up by Umar Abdullah, and it essentially said that if a Pakistani minister could be removed or could be sacked for his remarks against India, what's to say of the governor of India who is constantly reprimanding, the Muslim Kashmiris there? So it puts into context what the sentiment is across either side of the border.
You're absolutely right. Ever since we received that Human Rights Commission report from United Nations, I think thereafter the Kashmir issue definitely came into limelight and the international community started paying attention. You've seen that the British Parliament and also the European Parliament, they have been expressing their concern on whatever has been happening in Kashmir. But again, I think the international self-interest, they prevail and perhaps they have not been pushing. But after this episode, it has come out very, very clearly that that the Kashmiri people, they have been forced to move towards the direction where they are now becoming suicide bombers. At the same time, Pakistan has also drawn the attention that Kashmir is a flashpoint.
It is a flashpoint indeed, and just regarding that, General, like I'd also like to play this video clip for the viewers and for you from a mother of a slain Indian soldier.
कारगिल युद्ध में शहीद हो गए कैप्टन उमंग भारद्वाज, लेकिन मैं अपने बेटे और पोते किसी को भी आर्मी में जाना बिल्कुल पसंद नहीं करूंगी और जाने भी देना नहीं चाहती। ठीक है, जो आर्मी की हालात है इतनी खराब हो चुकी, कारगिल युद्ध की जो अभी वो मनाया जा रहा है, उनके पास जूते तक नहीं थे आर्मी में पहाड़ों में चढ़ने के लिए। जवान ऑफिसरों को पहाड़ों पे चढ़ाया गया है। किस लिए मारे गए? जिनकी ट्रेनिंग भी पूरी नहीं हुई। क्यों कारगिल युद्ध में भेजे गए बच्चे? वो माए नहीं थी जिन्होंने पाल के अपने ऑफिसर बनाए थे? क्यों नहीं ट्रेनिंग दे के भेजे गए सरकार ने? अपने बच्चे जाते नहीं है और बाकी बच्चों को मरवा देते हैं ले जाकर। क्यों? कौन सी खुशी मना रहे हैं अब ये? जूते थे उनके पैरों में, आइस से बचने के लिए कुछ था उनके पास बंदोबस्त, यूनिफॉर्म तक पूरी नहीं थी आर्मी के पास। कहाँ रहती है सरकार फिर उसके बाद? आप बताइए सरकार क्यों लोग आर्मी में जाएंगे? मैं तो कहती एक को भी आर्मी में नहीं जाना चाहिए। और मेरे स्कूल के अंदर 400 बच्चे पास आउट होते हैं 12th से, एक भी बच्चा जाना नहीं चाहता आर्मी के अंदर, एक भी नहीं कहता कि हम आर्मी में जाएंगे।
So you heard the video, you heard the sentiments of a mother of a slain Indian soldier talking about the discrepant, terrible circumstances in which they operate, not even having shoes, not having the proper protection that they deserve. General Amjad, it shows a very...
It is a very pathetic, I think, situation. On the one hand, if you see that we have a budget of about $8.15 billion and they have a budget of about $45 billion for their army, and then to say that they don't have the shoes, they don't have the uniform, I think it is very strange. Unless there is a large-scale, rampant corruption in the army, the things can never go that way, the way this mother has been expressing. It is very sad. But then I think the army will suffer, the Indian army will suffer because of that. In any case, in any army, in any institution, when you have rampant corruption, you can see the situation, you can see the degradation of that institution to the extent that they will not remain a functional institution. So I think this is what the Indians are also facing. Their people have been coming up on they have been posting video clips in which they have been expressing that they are not given good food. They have been talking about the high-handedness of their officers, where they have been misused for their own personal works and personal family gains. Such like things are unheard of. We don't have these things in our army. I think we have a very fine, disciplined force where we do not allow these people to indulge in any kind of personal gains. So unfortunately, these people, they don't have that force, but then they were misled by the Bollywood films and perhaps the slogans which were being raised by their leaders that they will perform miracles, they will decimate Pakistan, and ultimately they have landed into this kind of problem.
All right. Thank you so much, General Amjad, for your contribution there to Newswire. Now I have with us a former ambassador Mr. Zamir Akram, welcome to Newswire. We were just talking about the situation within India, whether the tensions across the border have finally diffused. What's your take on this?
I don't think that they have fully diffused. Perhaps the high level of escalation we had reached has come down. But I think that, especially from the Indian side, the rhetoric and the brinkmanship is still going on. If we, listen to Prime Minister Modi's speeches, so I think the tension is still there, and I think his motive is perhaps to try and do something that he can project as a major victory, because right now he feels that he's in a disadvantaged position militarily after the outcome that we've had in the last week or so.
How do you think, which position does this leave Modi's government when high-resolution satellite images from private satellite operators showing the building that India claimed that they had successfully hit shows that it's still standing days after India targeted with their warplanes?
Well, he is definitely very embarrassed, but and the Indian media, which had hyped up the entire situation, is also very embarrassed about trying to justify or trying to provide proof. And increasingly, people are asking questions which are embarrassing for the Prime Minister. But I think the propaganda machinery of the BJP and pliable media outlets in India are still playing up the same rhetoric that India, acquire or achieved a great victory. But it's wearing thin.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Zamir. And with that, I'd like to welcome our last guest, Lieutenant General Ziauddin Bhatt. Welcome to Newswire. Very quickly, trying to get your take on where do we stand right now in the international arena? Is Modi's India facing international isolation from as a consequence of its behavior in the past 2 weeks?
No, I don't think they are facing any isolation. But there is an awareness, international awareness, that the two nuclear powers should not fight and create a problem for the rest of the world. And for that reason, I think they are ready to interfere, and they're ready to take the things to the Security Council. But India is probably, because of the elections and other problems, they are not behaving themselves, and they're creating problems in like the submarine that was detected in our waters, which is our waters are 12 miles from the coast, and anything which enters that is an act of war. So and our Navy also has an air arm, and they could have taken it on, and that could have ignited another problem for the rest of the area. So I think that whatever they are doing is without any proper planning, and they are now desperate that they want to show Modi as a very effective Prime Minister and somebody who can take charge of the situation in the whole region, which is not happening. And Modi is probably thinking that he'll lose the elections this way, and sort of criticism of Modi in the Congress party itself.
Okay.
So these are all efforts to probably project Modi, and he keeps saying that we will go into the enemy country to sort them out. So Pakistan has taken very good steps.
Okay.
And as the Prime Minister said, they're ready to go 2 steps.
Pakistan continues to make efforts of peace. Thank you, Lieutenant General Ziauddin Bhatt. With that, we'll take a quick short break. Don't go away. You're watching Newswire. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. Now, 16 killed and 9 wounded in a suicide attack in Afghanistan's Jalalabad city. Officials have said that a gunfight had started after the bombers attacked the office of a private construction company near the city's airport. Now, this brings the overall number of insurgents killed in US-led air operations and ground operations to a stunning 102. Meanwhile, negotiations between the Taliban and the United States have paused in Doha, but reports confirm that they are set to restart over the weekend. Negotiations that were underway between the two adversaries over the withdrawal of foreign troops from the 18-year-old conflict in Afghanistan are being looked towards with positivity from around the world. The latest round of talks comes a month after the two walked away with a draft framework, which was focused on potential U.S. troop withdrawal and an agreement to prevent Afghanistan from being used as a staging ground from which terror attacks could be planned on foreign states. Now, where is this headed? How can we see the latest development of these talks? Let's talk to our guest. I'd like to welcome Ms. Amna Khan, who is joining us from the Islamabad studios, an Afghan expert with the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. How do you see this, Ms. Amna, the latest development of talks that have just taken place?
Well, of course, this has been the fifth round of talks that have been taking place between the Afghan Taliban and the US. And I've said this before as well, that I think the kind of developments we've seen regarding the peace process since 2018 till date have been unprecedented, and they have certainly been positive, and I think they should be welcomed, and certainly they warrant recognition as it is moving in the right direction. Pakistan, of course, has been saying since day one that the only way to end the Afghan conflict is to negotiate with the Afghan Taliban and achieve some sort of a deal with them. Unfortunately, as you just mentioned in the beginning of your show, the violence continues to escalate, and this is a factor that is going to derail the process. While the attack in Jalalabad, to the best of my knowledge, has so far not been, the Taliban haven't claimed responsibility. However, here I would like to say that before that, when we saw the attack in Helmand, that was claimed by the Afghan Taliban. And I think for the peace process to move forward, there has to be, some sort of a reduction in the violence, particularly from the Afghan Taliban side, because you see, they can no longer justify their violence or their so-called insurgency, because they're not fighting foreign forces any longer, but they're fighting Afghan national security forces who are fellow Afghans at the end of the day. So I think the Taliban need to, of course, reduce their violence, but at the same time, they're using this to put more pressure on the negotiating table and try and, gain from that. However, apart from, these major derailments, I think, the fact that both sides are negotiating is a step in the right direction. Eventually, Kabul has to be brought in. This is paramount. It is important. And I think the fact that there is, disappointment, there's frustration within the Ghani camp that they're being left out. Khalilzad is, letting them know on a daily basis what is happening. However, I think the momentum has to be continued because there is frustration in Kabul that they're not being included. But the Taliban have said that once some sort of a deal is achieved with the Americans, they will speak to Kabul. So I think there has to be, as I said, compromises on all sides, and a lot of patience has to be demonstrated by all the major stakeholders. Right. And in this particular case, unfortunately, it has to be Kabul.
Right. Ms. Amna, let me bring in another guest to this conversation. Mr. Feroz is a journalist. You're joining us from Germany. Welcome to Newswire. Let me get your take on the situation as violence escalates, irrespective of whether Taliban takes responsibility or not. Is this putting the peace talks under threat?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. And as Ms. Khan already said, it is a positive step in the right direction. And at the end, talks will end this war. But I think it is a really huge problem that the Afghan government is excluded from these talks because, as it was already mentioned, as we see the reality at the ground at the moment, in this very moment, the most people who are getting killed by these attacks are not foreign forces, they are Afghan soldiers. And many people, especially many Afghans, ask themselves if the war will continue after a deal with the Americans have been made. And if it will, if such attacks will continue or not, because we have also seen talks in Moscow with Afghan politicians and the Afghan Taliban a few weeks before.
Right.
And this was really also kind of problematic because you have seen politicians who always refuse to talk with the Taliban, and also the Taliban who refused to talk with these politicians when they were in power back then. For example, Mr. Hamid Karzai himself. But suddenly, all of them are sitting in Moscow and talking, and the only player who is excluded is again the Afghan government.
So, what do you think this indicates, Imran?
Yeah, I think that the Afghan government somehow hasn't become relevant anymore.
Relevant, or could it be a possibility that the opposition is looking for an opportunity, has the confidence that Taliban will come into power soon?
Yeah, of course. Also, you have to take a close look at this opposition. Many of these people are warlords and corrupt politicians who have lost their power after President Ashraf Ghani have made some steps against them. And now suddenly you find them on the other side of the table with the Taliban, talking with them. And of course, I think that they see it as some kind of opportunity to come back to power. And I'm not sure if this is also the case with Mr. Karzai himself. Some of the people who attended the Moscow conference told me that this is not the case. All the people who attended just want some real peace. But I wonder how this peace can happen with the exclusion of the Afghan government and when you continue to kill Afghan soldiers, because at the end of the day, as Ms. Khan already mentioned, they are fellow Afghans. And yeah, we can just hope that a deal between the Americans and the Taliban will be made sure that intra-Afghan talks will also happen.
Right. Now, before getting into the details of any possibility of intra-Afghan talks and what the timeline for that might look like, Ms. Amna, coming back to you in terms of violence, as you said, responsibility not yet claimed by Taliban for this latest suicide bombing. Could you talk a little more about other factions or terrorist groups in Afghanistan who would not be looking forward to any kind of peace talks?
Yes, well, just to mention what you just said a little just now. The second round of the intra-Afghan talks are apparently planned for the end of this month, and instead of Moscow, they will be held in Doha. So one has to see how those plan out. But yes, look, the fact is that you've got this growing presence, whether it's exaggerated or not, but there is the presence of the Islamic State of the Khorasan province, the ISKP as it's commonly known, which is the franchise of the Daesh, which is in the Middle East. This is a major faction in Afghanistan that is causing issues. And if we see last year when you had the ceasefire between the Afghan Taliban and the government, the only violence that was committed by the ISKP, which just shows that one of the biggest spoilers to the future of Afghanistan, and for that matter, the peace process, is the presence of the ISKP. So I personally feel that if some sort of a peace agreement is achieved between Kabul and the Afghan Taliban, they could join forces and in fact deny space to the ISKP, because the longer the conflict continues, this will provide space and vacuum for the ISKP to operate. And let it be mentioned here as well that a number of battles have been taking place between the ISKP and the Afghan Taliban, because there's a difference in their ideology, the fact that the Afghan Taliban are concentrated within the borders of Afghanistan, whereas, the ISKP believe in a greater caliphate and whatnot. So I think this is one of the biggest spoilers that has to be really looked into. And it is not something that just, I think Kabul and the Afghan Taliban seem to have a common enemy. It's a common enemy not only of the Americans, of the international community, but most importantly of the region. And if you see, there has been a change of perception within the regional countries, particularly Afghanistan's immediate neighbors, such as Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China. Because, the Daesh is a major issue of concern not only for the Pakistanis, but for the Iranians and for the Russians. And hence, now you see this consolidated approach amongst regional countries to push for the peace process, because that will in one way deny the ISKP presence within the region.
Right. And coming back to you, Imran, as we spoke about the different factions that are a threat, now trying to understand another big roadblock in the success of these peace talks is Taliban refusing to speak to the Afghan government. Now, Khalilzad hinted that there was headway on this issue, and he tweeted, and I quote, "There is also progress on forming a national team in Kabul ready to engage in intra-Afghan dialogue and talks with the Taliban." Now, what's your take on this national team that he's proposing? Is this going to be different from the earlier team that was trying to negotiate with the Taliban, the High Peace Council?
Yeah, I think if this really works out, and if we see this intra-Afghan dialogue between the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban, and if we see it hopefully soon, I think that this will head to the right direction, and hopefully also the current Afghan president Ashraf Ghani will understand that it has to be done like this, and any other way might be pretty difficult, because the president himself also often stated that he wants to lead these talks, and he also did not really appear happy when Mr. Khalilzad started the talks in Doha, and he was also very, very furious when all these other Afghan politicians met with the Taliban in Moscow. But I think that at the end of the day, also the Afghan president needs to understand that he's a part of all of this. He needs to be a part of all of this. His government needs to be a part of all of this, but it's not that they can take over and try to make what they want, as it's also the same for the other side, the Afghan Taliban.
Right. And coming back to you, Ms. Amna, also trying to get your version on this, that do you see any hope for the Taliban and being convinced to have an intra-Afghan dialogue, whether it is through the High Peace Council or it's through any kind of new national team that Khalilzad has hinted at?
To be very honest, I think the High Peace Council, unfortunately, wasn't very productive in that sense, and I don't think they really had the authority to do much. This intra-Afghan dialogue, I mean, I agree with what Mr. Imran said earlier on, that the same President Karzai, I remember, I think we can all recall when, the Taliban initiated the office in Doha, it was, President Karzai that kind of succumbed all the, the opening of the office and whatnot, and hence it derailed the process. So it's interesting now that the same people that derailed the process at one time are now willing to sit opposite the Afghan Taliban and speak to them. I do feel that, yes, eventually, there is no other way out. You cannot have any sort of a peace agreement unless and until Kabul is not included. Because, whether the Taliban like it or not, whether they call them the puppet regime or supported by the Americans, they are the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And at the end of the day, both sides will have to sit. And I think one has to be very clear here. The Taliban have categorically stated, not once but several times, that they will negotiate with Kabul, meaning the government of national unity, once some sort of a deal is achieved with the Americans. Now, to be very honest, if you're speaking from the Afghan Taliban side, it makes perfect sense, because even though President Ghani offered them an unprecedented offer again, last year when, he came up with those 7 points where he was willing to address and rather agree to all the demands of the Afghan Taliban, including recognizing them as, a political faction, willing to, release their prisoners, and even to speak on the constitution, which has been a major hurdle. The Afghan Taliban weren't really forthcoming. Why? Because there's a major trust deficit between both these parties. The Afghan Taliban have been categorical. They say that President Ghani, or any government for that matter, in Kabul cannot deliver.
Right.
And that's true. So, at the end of the day, I mean, it's the same American.
Right. Let Ms. Amna stay with us. And Mr. Imran, stay with us, please. Let me welcome another guest who is just joining us, Mr. Intizar Khadim, a journalist from Kabul. Welcome to Newswire. Just trying to get your version now on the development that has taken place as the fifth round of peace talks between the US and Taliban have taken a pause there. There is talk about the forming of a national team in Kabul that will eventually be talking to the Afghanistan Taliban. But in light of the violence escalating in Afghanistan itself, where do you see this headed?
Well, thank you very much. I think it has been our very earlier call on the government that they have to form a national team where they should understand the real politics of the country, where they have to be involved in the peace and in war issues of the country. They have to be representing the political parties. They have to understand only the national interest rather than to be a political interest. The earlier negotiation team or committee from the Afghan side, they have been so much into the government people
and now hopefully this is a progress that we are making in the entire process. I mean, that could be a sign of positive progress toward the future. Second is the very long talk between Khalilzad and the Afghan Taliban. We were not hoping that this talk will long for another 5 or 6 days, and even so far, still there is possibility that there will be talk for more 2 or 3 days. I mean, as long as the talk is long in Khalilzad and in the Taliban leadership are sitting in one room for a long discussion, it gives hope for all the parties to have a wish for a bit of result. Third is the announcement of Secretary Pompeo, the State Department Minister. He just said that I will be joining by myself personally the talk with the Mullah brother, which is a very big progress because Khalilzad and the Taliban leadership who are talking right now, have not been people with absolute power. If Mullah brother or maybe Pompeo is joining the talk, I think that's again a hope for all the parties to wish for a better result from the peace issues.
Also, Mr. Khadim, I want to bring in while we're talking about the US's involvement, of course, they've talked about troop withdrawal, but recently the National Security Advisor Bolton came out and said that we are thinking of leaving a counter-terrorism team. That means essentially not withdrawing all 14,000 troops from Afghanistan. How is this perceived in Afghanistan itself?
Well, I can say that both the Taliban leadership and the American government are trying political techniques. They would like to hit each other on a back so they can bow down and just retreat and go back a little from their hard nation or peace talk. Taliban leadership are saying that there should be an absolute exit from the U.S. forces from Afghanistan, and then the actual talk of peace will start from there. And now you see a black and white statement from the Pentagon and from the American side, and they said, okay, we're sending counterterrorism, and so far one of the conditions where the Khalilzad or maybe the American delegation put on table for Taliban is that, okay, we will exit from Afghanistan, but are you sure that Afghanistan will not be used again against the interest of the Americans? It's a very, very big question, and I'm not sure if Taliban will be able to answer alone in solo, because Afghanistan is a diverse country. There is some proxies from different countries. The American abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan will create some more difficulties. That's why there is a type of brain making or mind setting from both the Taliban leadership and the American side that, okay, if all the American forces are not leaving Afghanistan, there should be a few hundred counterterrorism forces where they can fight, trace in, and defeat and dismantle terrorism who will be posing threats to the Afghan leadership, the Taliban leadership if they're part of the Afghan government, and also the Americans. So it's more like a black and white statement from both sides. So they would like each other on the table to soften their condition and get less privileges in return of a peace deal from each side.
So just trying to understand, Mr. Khadim, how does this dynamic work, especially when the National Security Advisor goes on record and says there's no blind trust with the Taliban while these negotiations are taking place, and also it goes against the very demand that Taliban has for complete withdrawal. So how does this dynamic work?
Well, it's quite good. I mean, if I'm Bolton instead of him, I will say the same thing. I will not blindly trust the Taliban leadership. They have been away from the political power and spectrum for long years. Now, if they return back, I think that could be a litmus test both for the Taliban leadership and also for the American, how they will be engaging with Afghan government. Why not? They should not say that. I mean, definitely quite good statement by the Bolton. At the same level, Taliban leadership also have mistrust on the American side and say, okay, if we have a talk and if we reach any conclusion, a peace deal, and you say that, okay, we leave Afghanistan and still you stay in Afghanistan, what could be a driving force that will press you to accept your promises and leave Afghanistan? So still, when we say peace process, it's not peace project. It's very complicated, it's tedious, it's long. This dynamism which is going on right now is the true nature of peace negotiation. It's not only in Afghanistan but also in all over the world. So I'm more optimistic toward the future, and I think both sides are just going very carefully forward. They're putting a type of condition where they can bond each other on that. so EU person can follow that, can trust that, and can ensure the mutual and reciprocated promises toward each other.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Khadim, for your valuable there. Let me come back to you, Ms. Amna. How do you see this? Could this be a possible deal breaker for these negotiations for the Afghan Taliban if, as John Bolton says, that the US has decided to keep a counter-terrorism team in Afghanistan?
First of all, I think before any deal or any agreement is reached, I think two things have to be pressed upon by the major stakeholders. One is that it has to be a measured and a very responsible withdrawal, because as the other participant just said, we've seen what happened in the past. A hasty withdrawal will be complete chaos. And again, the regional countries will have to face the brunt, and so will the Afghans themselves. Secondly, if a ceasefire is agreed upon, it has to be sustained, and there has to be guarantors. And those could be from the Muslim community, it could be from the Muslim Ummah, the OIC, or the UN, or even regional countries. So these two things need to be pressed upon. Now, coming to the negotiations that are taking place and regarding this withdrawal and whatnot, this hasn't come as a surprise, by the way. From my understanding, the agreement, if at all, will be that both the Taliban and the Americans will have face saving. It's not going to be a complete withdrawal because of the difference between withdrawal and drawdown. And there are only 14,000 troops. So according to my understanding, if a deal is achieved, it will be that the Americans, for electoral campaign and whatnot, will say that we have taken the troops out of Afghanistan. So that's face saving for the Americans. They can say they won the war. Similarly, the Taliban can tell their fighters that, look, we threw the Americans out and the Americans did withdraw from Afghanistan. Then once some sort of an agreement is agreed upon, even if it's a patchy framework and a patchy setup, the Americans will come back in the form of reconstruction or development. And the Taliban can say that, well, we invited the Americans to come back, or the Americans are coming back on our terms. And this is exactly what has been discussed upon within the Moscow format, the previous one and the one in February. So this is something that has already been discussed upon because, the fact that the Americans want the Taliban to say that they will not let their soil be used against any particular country or even host any sort of militant group shows that this counterterrorism force will be essential, and it will be an essential part of this agreement. So I don't think it has come as a surprise, and this is something that both parties are talking about as we speak.
Right. And Imran, let me come to you on the last question. So we're running out of time. Very quickly, to try and understand how, if at all, the senators who are pushing for a legislation, the US senators are pushing for a legislation to end the 18-year war in Afghanistan, to bring all troops home, stating of the lives lost, thousands of lives lost, and also the over $2 trillion spent. How does this affect at all in reaching a fair negotiation? Does this influence in any way in leverage to the Afghan Taliban?
Yeah, I think it definitely, if the American public and the US Congress makes such a decision, it's of course a lot of pressure also on the policymakers in Washington to somehow end this war. And I think that this is also maybe the danger, that they make some problematic decisions, or they try to get out quickly, as many people say. But in general, we have also we shouldn't forget that what we just discussed in terms of the so-called counter-terrorism operations that should continue in Afghanistan after a withdrawal, I think that many of these operations are still very, very problematic, and it's also very difficult to discuss about these issues. And I'm wondering if they are actually talking in Doha about things like CIA-backed militias in Afghanistan who commit gross human rights violations,
right,
and drone strikes, other things. A lot of operations who did not kill so-called terrorists, but also many civilians, and also fuel a lot of extremism and militancy in the region.
Got it. Thank you so much, Mr. Imran and Ms. Amna, for your time and contribution to Newswire. Those are really good points that we discussed, but that's unfortunately all the time we have. And with that, we have to wind up. We'll see you next week. Till then, goodbye, and keep watching Indus News.